Good evening, everyone. I'm Hope Preston, and welcome to the March meeting for the Washington County Master Gardeners, with our presentation tonight being from Aaron Anderson, who's talking about conserving invertebrates at home. And Aaron, I'm pleased to say, is one of us. He has got his PhD from Oregon State and has been working on pollinator conservation and restoring habitat for several endangered butterfly species before he went to work for Xerces, where I am sure he is continuing to do good work. He is the pesticide program specialist. So Aaron's going to talk to us this evening, and if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A, and at the end of his presentation, I will go through the questions and read them off to him. So don't hesitate to ask questions, but we won't be stopping the presentation to answer them. And if you are a master gardener, I encourage you to stay on after the presentation for our chapter meeting. Srijana Shrestha, our new program director, I'm actually not sure what her title is. That's something we will get straightened out, but she's going to tell us a little bit about herself and what's going on with the training that we have been missing the last few years. So, Aaron, I turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Hope. Well, I'm so excited to be here talking to you tonight about creating habitat for invertebrates and beneficial insects in the home yard. And yeah, thank you all for having me. As Hope said, my name is Aaron. I'm a pesticide program specialist for the Xerces Society. And yeah, I mostly work in residential landscapes, encouraging people to reduce pesticide use and create habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects in residential landscapes. And before I dive into my talk here, I do want to first acknowledge and thank all of these Xerces Society supporters, because without them, we couldn't do the work that we do, and their support is really so important. And on that note, I do want to add a plug that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't a member and you're able, I encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll join a group of people who are truly passionate and committed about protecting invertebrates and their habitat. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, if this is your first webinar with us, we've been around since 1971 working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. We have programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and we also do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas. And this slide here has some photos with some of those representative landscapes kind of pictured. Yeah, we have people working on mussels, which is the top right photo, which is really cool, I think. But perhaps I think the most helpful work we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And you can visit our Xerces website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, all sorts of things. And this library is really decades of work and has fantastic resources. So I encourage you all to go check it out. Yeah, there's all sorts of great materials on habitat creation, plant selection, endangered species conservation, pesticide reduction, and a whole lot more. So I want to give you a quick little roadmap of where we're going with this talk tonight. I want to talk a little bit about insect declines and conservation, beneficial insects, and then talk about creating habitat at home for those beneficial insects, and then talking about protecting that habitat you're creating from pesticides. Okay, so to set the stage, why are insects so important? Why are we so concerned about conserving them? And the answer is insects do so much for ecosystems and for us. Oops, sorry, I skipped ahead there. So insects, and I'm sure this is review for many of you, but it's still, I think, really important to kind of remember why we're so concerned about insects and why they're so important. They recycle nutrients throughout the ecosystem. They're soil engineers and decomposers. There was a study in Massachusetts that found that ants moved 30 tons of soil per acre per year, which I find really astounding. They also offer us free pest control services. Predators and parasitoids, which we'll get into a little bit later in this talk, do so much work keeping pest insects in check, both in our home yards and in agricultural systems. Insects are also food sources for other animals, and they're incredibly important. One example I love to share is that chickadees need to eat 10,000 caterpillars to fledge a nest, and that's just over 3 weeks. So that's 450 caterpillars a day that young chickadees need to eat. And then finally, invertebrates are pollinators. They help plants reproduce, and the seeds and the fruits that are produced by that are also foods for other animals. So touching on that last subject, pollination, pollinators are incredibly important for natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue seeding in their environments. And the seeds and the fruits that those flowering plants produce are food sources for many of other types of wildlife, including birds. And the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower really helps build out the base of the food chain for many species. And insects are also part of that base themselves. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives. And some birds will also eat bees occasionally. And pound for pound, insects actually contain more than twice as much protein as beef does, which I find also really interesting. So most of you are likely already aware of this, but many recent studies are documenting declines in insect populations in communities worldwide. In particular, many pollinators, including bees and butterflies, are imperiled. And the data is patchy since many insects, in fact, most insects, aren't carefully monitored. But the data that we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and other insects. So there's several key drivers of insect declines that scientists agree on. And a major one is habitat loss, in particular due to agricultural intensification. Think of those large monocrops that produce no food for pollinators like corn and soybeans. And these areas also typically have high amounts of pesticides and row-to-row farming that leaves really no habitat left on the landscape. There's also been accelerating land use change, in particular urban sprawl in many parts of the country and world. Which has removed habitat as well. Invasive species are also a concern as they can outcompete the native host plant species that insects rely on. And then climate change is another major driver, as well as pathogens and disease. And the final driver is pesticide use. Insecticides kill insects directly, and in low quantities, they can cause these subtle yet still harmful effects like diminished reproduction, slower colony growth, altered ability to find food, and even pesticides that have been thought to be safe for insects, like certain fungicides and herbicides, are recently drawing more scrutiny as independent studies are finding harmful impacts. So when we make our residential spaces tidy by removing plant diversity and using pesticides, we're removing habitat and also making those spaces hostile to most insect life. So despite the doom and gloom on that last slide, I want to stress that our residential landscapes, where we live and where we work, can support beneficial insects. And in fact, these landscapes can really harbor surprisingly abundant and diverse insect communities, largely because we provide flowering resources all, spring into fall in the form of flowering plants in our yards and our parks. And then these areas can also have lower pesticide exposure than surrounding agricultural areas, so they can kind of serve as refuges for these insects. So because of this, residential areas really do have a high conservation potential for invertebrates, which I find really exciting, kind of working in these spaces. But they have an even greater potential if we design and manage these spaces, thinking about the needs of these insects. Okay, so now since we're talking about conserving invertebrates at home in this talk, I want to start off by talking about some of the beneficial insects that your yard can support if we're providing habitat and not using pesticides. And a lot of you might be already familiar with a lot of these groups and species, but in case you don't, I think it's really helpful to review and also just kind of refresh your kind of mental image of what to look for, especially now that it's almost spring and we're going to start seeing more insect activity in our yards. It's kind of fun to be like, oh yeah, this is what I should kind of keep an eye out for. Uh, So let's start with pollinators. There's a lot of different animals that visit flowers, usually for their sugary nectar, and end up pollinating those plants. I have some example images of them on this slide. We have butterflies, moths, beetles, hummingbirds, even some flies, in particular syrphid flies, like the one in that top purple flower in the middle. They all provide pollination services. You probably realized I didn't mention bees. They get their own slide. Bees are our most important pollinators. We have an amazing diversity of native bees in the US. There's more than 5,000 species in North America and about 3,600 that we know of in the US alone. I've heard guesses in Oregon anywhere between 500 to 800, which is really astounding. And they range in size from big carpenter bees and bumblebees to tiny bees about the size of a grain of rice. And a lot of them don't look like what you might picture when you think of a bee, like the metallic green sweat bee that's in the bottom center right. I think it's a beautiful bee, in my opinion. And about 70% of our native bees nest in the ground in just little tunnels, while the other 30% nest above ground in cavities and stems. And these are all different than the European honeybee, which is a managed non-native species. And with the exception of bumblebees, our native bees don't form colonies. They're mostly solitary, so it's just an individual female that's going around and collecting pollen, building a nest, laying her eggs, providing that pollen for her eggs, for her offspring. She's doing all of the work. So another major group of invertebrates that you're going to find in your yard are predators, and I'm sure you're all familiar with things like lady beetles. You have ground beetles, lacewings, and predatory bugs like this big-eyed bug in the center here. Spiders are great predators. So these are invertebrates that consume pest insects, thereby controlling their populations. And predators tend to be generalists, meaning they eat a wide variety of other insects. So ambush and assassin bugs are really cool looking insects and are great examples of predators. Both the immature stages, the nymphs, as well as the adults are predatory, and they eat a wide variety of prey, including caterpillars, beetles, leafhoppers, and they overwinter in leaf litter, under bark, and adults will drink some nectar. And with predators in general, many times the adults will sip on nectar and actually eat pollen as well to supplement their diet. So they're kind of more omnivores than carnivores. So you might see syrphid flies or hoverflies in your garden. The larvae of syrphid flies are predators, and a single larva can actually eat hundreds of aphids a week. And the adults, meanwhile, they feed on pollen and nectar and are actually pollinators, so you kind of get a double bonus with syrphid flies. And they overwinter in the leaf litter or in the soil of your yard. The next one, again, is one that you all, I'm sure, are very familiar with, lady beetles. They're fantastic natural enemies because they're predatory as both larvae and adults, and individuals can consume as many as 5,000 aphids in their lifetime. They'll also eat things like mites, whiteflies, scale insects, eggs of all sorts of other insects. And the adults will also eat pollen and nectar, and they overwinter under vegetation or bark. Another common predator group are big-eyed bugs and minute pirate bugs. So these are pretty small. They're just 2 to 5 millimeters long. And again, both the adults and the nymphs are predators. And in general, these are really great predators of soft-bodied insects. So think caterpillars and aphids. But some of the larger predatory true bugs often have a more diverse prey preference. And they also overwinter in leaf litter and underbark. You're probably sensing a theme there. So predatory wasps. You might think of wasps and think of them as nuisances, things that are kind of scary, but predatory wasps actually hunt insects as prey and bring them back to their nests to feed their larvae who need protein to develop. Adults, meanwhile, feed on flowery nectar or sugar secretions from their larvae. So some predatory wasps that you might see, besides yellow jackets, which obviously, aren't fun, are mason wasps, paper wasps, digger wasps. And these all tend to be not very aggressive. Conflicts still can happen with people, say if a paper wasp makes a nest right next to your back door. But other than that, lots of these, especially the solitary species, most of these are solitary. They nest underground in tunnel cavities. They don't tend to be very aggressive because they don't have a nest to defend. So I also want to touch on parasitoids. Oops, jumping there. So this is another group of natural enemies that you'll find in your yard, and I think parasitoids are super cool. They're a lot less visible because they're really small, so many people are less familiar with them. And parasitoids are insects that live on or in a host insect, and then they feed on the host and kill it in the process. And most parasitoids are these really tiny, small, stingless wasps. There's also flies that are parasitoids, and they lay their eggs in or on top of specific host insects. And they have an incredibly important impact on pest insect populations, providing a really amazing amount of pest control in both home gardens and in farms. It's a really incredibly diverse group of insects. It's suspected that every insect species has at least one parasitoid that feeds on it, and there's hundreds of thousands of species in the world of parasitoids. And they can be so tiny that they're just microscopic, only parasitizing the eggs of a particular insect species, and others are larger and more general in the selection of prey that they feed on. And another great thing to know is that they can't sting, so there's no need to be worried in the garden. There's likely dozens of parasitoid species in your yard, and the developing larvae are what consume the host. The adults just tend to sip on flower nectar for energy. Okay, so now that we just briefly touched on some of the diversity of different, beneficial insects that you can find in the yard, what are the things we need to consider when we're creating habitat for these beneficial creatures? Luckily, a lot of the same resources are needed by pollinators as well as natural enemies, so multifunctional habitat for beneficials is pretty easy to create. So there's three basic habitat requirements that all beneficial insects, from pollinators to lady beetles, require. And these are just food, shelter, and then refuge from pesticides. So let's dive in and talk about these. Okay, let's start with food. So plants provide food for herbivores. And just because an insect is an herbivore doesn't mean it's a pest. Caterpillars eating leaves are a great example. And bees and other insects that eat pollen and nectar also count as herbivores. And plants obviously provide food for these insect species. And as I mentioned when we were talking about predators, many predators also rely on pollen or nectar at specific periods of their life cycle, or they can use these floral resources to supplement their diets when insect prey aren't available. So flowers are really important for everybody. So when it comes to invertebrate habitat, we recommend gardeners use native plants. Research shows that native plants tend to support greater numbers of pollinator species, and they also tend to support vertebrate wildlife better, like birds. In Doug Tallamy's lab at University of Delaware, for example, they found that native trees support about 4 times the herbivorous insects that non-natives do, which in turn means they supported, a lot more birds. You can also create some really resilient plant communities. Another thing that research studies have shown is that diverse native plantings have increased beneficial insect populations, which will make your yard and plant community more resilient to attack or infestation from pest insects. You can also often reduce water use and fertilization. Not to say ornamental plants also can't be drought tolerant, obviously, but if you're using native plants that are adapted to our region, many people argue you have to use less irrigation and fertilization. So an important consideration when you're installing your native plants for invertebrates is to use plants that provide continuous bloom across the year. Here are some favorites of mine on this slide from each kind of snapshot of spring, early summer, midsummer, or late summer. Most pollinators and other insects live very short lives, and in different species of insects, live those short lives at different times of year. And your garden can support a variety of different bees as well as other beneficial insects, all with different emergence times and different flight periods. So you'll see some species that are only flying for a few weeks or a month. They emerge, they mate, lay eggs, and then provision their nest with pollen and die all within a handful of weeks. So you really want to make sure that you're providing resources for those insects, during that short period of time when they're out and about. Another important consideration when selecting native plantings for pollinators is to include plants from a diversity of plant families. And this will provide habitat that may support more species of specialist pollinators, for example, and beneficial insects. This is particularly true if you also include host plants for butterflies and moths, who often have much narrower host plant requirements because when they're caterpillars, they're feeding on leaves of these species. And here's another kind of suite of some native plants. I actually accidentally chose all pink ones here, but I do like all of these as well. So at Xerces, we do have planting lists for pollinators and beneficial insects. Our region is covered by the Maritime Northwest list. Obviously, this is just an example. There's so many different native plants out there that are great to plant, but hopefully this can be a helpful starting point for anybody interested in diving in who kind of needs a reference. Okay, so we just talked about beneficial insects and plantings for them, and I hope that was somewhat helpful. I Now that we talked about that a little bit, I wanted to quickly touch on cultivars. So non-native plants can certainly provide habitat for pollinators and other insects as well. I want to note that even though we recommend for habitat in particular native plants whenever possible. But it's best to avoid ornate modern varieties or cultivars, which often produce little or no nectar. Garden varieties are often bred for characteristics that are desirable to humans and not to bees. And some horticultural varieties and hybrids have been bred for things like double petals, which loses the plant's ability to produce nectar or pollen. All plants are not equal. Just because it blooms doesn't mean it gives pollen or nectar, and just because it gives pollen and nectar doesn't mean it's a great resource necessarily. So I wanted to dive in on native plants in particular. So on that cultivar point, I did want to mention the use of nativars versus wild-type native plants for habitat planting, since it's a question that does come up sometimes. So nativars are cultivated native plants. So these are those that have been bred, again, for some trait that we as humans find desirable, like color, size, disease resistance, shape, things like that. So what does this mean for plants as habitat? And the answer is there's a lot of unknowns. To be frank, there hasn't been a ton of research in this area. I do want to note my old lab mate, Jen Hayes at Oregon State, who's in Gail Langelato's lab, is looking at this for a subset of Pacific Northwest pollinator plants. She's studying how heavily bred a native is impacts its visitation by pollinators. So if you're interested, stay tuned for Jen's research. But there has been some research done, in other places around the country, and in general, research has suggested that the more heavily bred flowers are, the less attractive they are to pollinators. So, with the framework of this talk, if you're talking about putting in plants with the goal to increase pollinator and beneficial insect habitat, we'd certainly encourage the use of wild-type natives over cultivars, just to be cautious and make sure you're providing the best resources. This is, of course, context specific. There are studies where certain plants in certain locations have shown that they provide, perfectly good, if not more resources than natives. But the general trend, when you're looking at the evidence out there on the broad scale, is that nativars tend to provide, a little bit poorer quality habitat than native plants do. Uh, and there might be several reasons for this. I just kind of wanted to touch on this real quick. One is just visual modification. So one of the things that bees use to locate flowers are these markings called nectar guides, which help guide the bee to the flower. So bees can see ultraviolet light, which means flowers look a lot different to bees than they do to us. And I have an example on this slide here. So when the color of a flower is bred to be different, flowers can lose these markings that bees rely on. Another consideration is just that plants have finite resources. So if they're investing more color or into some other trait, sorry, if they're investing more into color or into some other trait, they may be able to devote less resources to pollen and nectar production and produce kind of a less poor quality resources for pollinators. Um, and again, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, in really dramatic cases where you have a double petaled flower, if you think about a wild rose versus a cultivated traditional garden rose, the structure can really actually physically exclude pollinators from even being able to access the flowers. Okay, so in addition to food, beneficial insects need shelter and nesting habitat. And in fact, the availability of nesting and overwintering habitat is one of the most important factors influencing populations of native bees and other beneficial insects. So besides plants, which we talked about, shelter also includes stems, leaf litter, tussocks, brush piles, rock piles, stumps, all sorts of other things like that that you would find in the yard. As I mentioned, that 70% of our native bee species nest in the ground, leaving some bare soil that isn't covered by plants or mulched, like that top center photo. You can see that bee beginning to dig into that soil is a great idea as well to provide nesting resources for ground nesting bees. So I guess to better get at this, you might ask, where do insects and other invertebrates go in the winter? And the vast majority of them overwinter right where they spend all summer. They're just less active and they're more hidden. As you may have realized when I was going through those natural enemy examples, most of them overwinter underneath leaves or brush or bark, relying on that to protect and insulate them. So whatever your landscape is, you can ensure that there's resources for nests and overwintering. By leaving leaves in your yard into the fall, winter, and then into the spring. So leaving the leaves and other plant debris doesn't have to mean sacrificing your yard to the wilderness. Leaves don't have to be left exactly where they fall. You can rake them into garden beds and around tree bases or into other designated areas. Too many leaves can kill grass, but in soil, they can suppress weeds, help retain moisture, and also boost nutrition. And I want to note that you should avoid shredding leaves with a mower. You want to make sure you're trying to keep those leaves whole for best cover and to protect the eggs and insects that are already living there. If you do decide that you want to clean up the leaves and debris in the spring, make sure you wait until late into the season so you don't destroy all of that life that you've worked hard to protect. In addition to leaving the leaves, you can also save the stems in your yard. So bees, like I mentioned, there's about 30% of our native bees nest in stems, and they typically nest in older plant stems, not the new growth. And this slide here has, I think, a really neat cross-section of a bee nest in a stem. You can kind of see where the pollen has been packed in, and you can see the bee larva. And the key when you're doing this is to leave a variety of different heights. You don't want to take the stems all the way down to the ground because then there won't be enough room for a bee to actually nest in there. I tend to kind of err on the side of cutting high. And then you want to leave those old stems over the summer and the subsequent fall and winter as the bees will slowly develop and emerge the following spring and summer. And when new growth in that plant kind of comes in, these old stems will largely be hidden and eventually decompose. So plants like goldenrods, asters, caneberries are all good options that kind of have a little bit of a pithy stem that bees of different size can kind of chew their way in and nest in. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about providing food, providing shelter and overwintering, now let's dive into the last requirement, protection from pesticides and pesticide risks. And the reason for this is we don't want to go through all of the work of creating great habitat in our yards just to have insects then exposed to toxic pesticides. So before we talk about pesticides, let's talk a little bit about pests. First, what do we consider a pest? So one definition is competitors with humans for resources. So this could be a moth that defoliates forest trees, a terrestrial weed that outcompetes food crops, an aquatic weed that chokes out aquatic food webs, that type of thing. We also have enemies that harm humans, including those that transmit diseases like rats, mosquitoes, ticks, things that carry disease. And then there's nuisance organisms. So these are things we don't like, but they don't actually cause real harm or damage. So this might be things like ants in a picnic shelter or dandelions in the grass. So this is kind of a spectrum. Some of these things might need management, while others might not. And I think something that's really important to keep in mind is that the vast majority of insect species are directly beneficial to humans or are otherwise foundational to ecosystems. Less than 2% of described insect species are what we might consider pests. And even those can be beneficial. Many pest species are the food source for other insects. Having a low level of pests supports those natural enemies like predators and parasitoids that we've been talking about. But we still commonly use pesticides on these organisms, and many of the chemicals used for insect, disease, and weed management are harmful to more than just the target species. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about pesticide sprays. If you recall at the top of the talk, I mentioned that pesticides are a leading cause of insect declines. So I just wanted to make sure we kind of dove in and understand kind of what some of these risks involved with them are and why it's important to protect habitat in your yard from them. Let's see. Oh, I didn't mean to skip ahead there. Sorry. So when we're talking about pesticide sprays, um, uh, lots of times we mean insecticides, which kill insects, as well as herbicides that kill plants and fungicides, which kill fungi. There's a lot more different categories of pesticides, but these are what we tend to be most concerned with in the home yard. And I'm sure, all of you are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators, as well as other insects. And some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They'll kill the target pest, but also everything else. And modern insecticides are very potent, and newer ones, you may have heard of neonicotinoids or neonics. They've been made to replace some of the older chemicals, aren't actually more friendly to bees and are more concerning in many ways. And I also want to note real quick before we move on that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they really only treat the symptom, the pest outbreak itself. Not the cause of the outbreak. And we kind of say it's like taking Advil for a headache when you really need to get new glasses or stop staring at computer screens. So this might be a little bit in the weeds, pun intended, but I wanted to briefly touch on pesticide oversight and why just following the label on a bottle of pesticides isn't enough to protect pollinators. In fact, we want to do much more than just following the label on pesticides. Current federal regulation states that pesticides should have, quote, no unreasonable adverse effects, but that's really open to interpretation. Federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. They just believe that the benefits provided by pesticides outweigh the harm that they cause. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or create havens for insects in our yards, that standard isn't enough, which is why we encourage people to go beyond just following what's on the label to find ways to truly protect these species. So there's a long list of ways that the EPA, which is the federal agency that oversees pesticides and their assessments, that their assessments underestimate risk to pollinators, which then can lead to harmful pesticide uses. And I'll just list a few of those concerns really quickly, just so you have a picture of kind of what we're talking about. So one is that these assessments focus only on one chemical at a time, but pesticides are rarely found alone in the environment, whether we're sampling water, soil, or pollinator habitat. Um, we at Xerces actually did a study looking at pesticide residues on milkweed plants in California, up and down the Central Valley, and we found up to 25 pesticides on a single plant, with an average of 9 pesticides per plant. And the thing is that we almost never know how these pesticides are interacting together and then what the impact on invertebrates is. These assessments also don't consider specific risks to native bees and butterflies, like contaminated soil for ground nesting bees isn't considered, even though independent research has shown harm, or what this exposure does to the immature stages of insects instead of adults. And then another problem with standard toxicity testing is that it really heavily weighs one outcome in the decision making, which is death. But bees or other insects that are exposed to less than a dose that kills them can have other negative responses, and we call these sublethal effects. So a sublethal effect is anything short of death. So this could include decreased growth, a behavioral change in learning ability to navigate to find a patch of flowers and find their way back to the nest. Which these are all things that might reduce a bee or other insects' ability to gather food for its offspring or reproduce. Even though the individual itself might not be killed, these small effects can add up at the population level if insects are less able to reproduce. So with COVID tests being so common these days, lots of people talk about false negatives due to COVID testing. And similarly, you can kind of think of the EPA's risk assessment process as allowing for false negatives and that we miss some of the actual risk to insects. So we're obviously concerned about insecticide use because of the immense direct and indirect impacts that insecticides have on pollinators, because they're obviously designed to kill insects. But I also want to emphasize that we're also concerned about more than just insecticides. In particular, there are both fungicides and herbicides that have been shown to have negative impacts on pollinators. Fungicides are often classified as practically non-toxic, but some have been linked with subtle yet harmful impacts. For example, symptoms resembling malnutrition were noted after exposure to some fungicides, and some other types of fungicides can actually interact synergistically with certain insecticides, which means that they increase the toxicity to bees when they're present together. And for herbicides, the main impact of herbicides is that they remove flowers from the landscape, which of course, are what bees and other insects rely on for food. But there have also been studies that suggest glyphosate may impact bees' abilities to navigate and interfere with bees' gut microbiomes and might make them more susceptible to disease. And similar issues have been found with other herbicides. But the thing is that most haven't been studied independently. So unfortunately, it's not as easy as saying, oh, you can just switch away from glyphosate. There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to herbicides and the impact on many different insect species. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the risks associated with pesticides, um, now let's talk about, kind of avoiding pesticide use, I guess. So to avoid pesticide use, as you're managing your yard habitat, you should focus on preventing issues rather than treating pests as they arise. You're all master gardeners, so I'm sure this is review for a lot of you. But I think it's important to kind of remember, especially in the habitat context. But a great start is just choosing the right plants for the local conditions, or as everybody says, right plant, right place. If you have a sunny and dry yard, you want to use drought-tolerant species. If you have a wet or shady yard, you'd want to use plants that grow well in those conditions. Because if you put a plant that loves shade into a hot, dry place, it's obviously either going to die or just be really stressed trying to survive, and then it won't have the resources to fight off pests or diseases. So next, of course, you want to water appropriately to provide plants with the correct resources. Not too much, not too little, depending on what your plant's needs are. And the best options for garden watering are, the soaker hoses or drip irrigation, not the overhead sprinklers that go back and forth. The reason that we say for this is, because those overhead sprinklers tend to just water the top inch or two of soil and promotes shallow root growth. And by promoting deeper root growth with drip irrigation, your plants will better be able to withstand heat and drought stress later in the season, and again, just be more resistant to pests and pathogens. Another consideration too of the overhead sprinklers is that there has been some kind of tentative research done that, again, since bees can see UV light, that the reflection of, kind of the wet irrigation moisture on the flowers can interfere with bees' abilities to kind of see those flowers when they're wet. So another thing to think about is building healthy soils, just making sure you have correct nutrient and pH values, again, just to make sure the plants are healthy and then they can better fight off pests. You can get inexpensive soil tests through soil labs and university extension, which will, of course, tell you if your soil is deficient in anything. And then the last thing is just simply to, ensure that your plants are spaced out so that they receive, good sunlight and airflow, which will make them less stressed and less susceptible to issues like powdery mildew. And though I think these are all good gardening tips in general, this relates to, again, to pest outbreaks in particular, because stressed plants have a more difficult time mustering defenses against infection or infestation. I also want to note that when it comes to actively controlling pests, the most important pest control are natural enemies. So we've kind of brought the talk full circle here, talking about natural enemies. As we discussed earlier, the key to bolstering natural enemy populations in your yard is plant diversity. When you're creating habitat, a diversity of plants is best, and including a variety of flowering plants will provide resources for those natural enemies, not just the bloom duration and ability to have plants for specialists like we were talking about, but also just different textures, sizes, things like that. A lot of natural enemies like parasitoids, use microhabitats, so little shady spots in the plant or the yard to where there's maybe a little bit more protection from wind and a little bit more moisture trapped there to kind of help survive during the really hot, dry parts of the day. Creating this type of habitat can hopefully reduce the threat of pest infestations that could impact your entire garden. And I kind of have a little bit of a visual of that. I'm going to use lawns as kind of an extreme example. So touching on lawns, there's actually over 40 million acres of lawns in the US, and lawns support far fewer pollinators, beneficial insects, and things like songbirds than flowering native plants do. So to better visualize this, here's a representation of a food web supported by a lawn. It's functionally a monocrop of, just one plant species that provides very few resources to invertebrates. And then here's a diverse habitat planting in a yard that I also think looks really beautiful. And it supports so many more insects, both herbivores that are using the plantings as a resource, but then as you go up the food chain, as these are eaten by other insects, and then birds. And this will help better support natural enemies, and then hopefully keep pest populations in balance. But problems do arise even in a really well-planned garden, with a diverse community of natural enemies. So I did want to quickly touch on, how you can kind of nip these issues in the bud, even though this could be, its own talk. So to manage pests and diseases, the most important thing you need to know is the pest's life cycle, and habitat needs so that you can break that cycle. So it's really important to know exactly who you're dealing with before you make any decisions about management. And remember, just because something is eating your plants doesn't mean it's harmful. But of course, there's other times where you don't want an herbivore destroying your plants. So this photo is from my colleague, Emily May, who found these caterpillars munching on her purple coneflowers in her garden. She lives in Vermont. And she wanted these because the flowers provide food for pollinators and they also look nice. So to get an ID, not everybody might know an entomologist, but there's lots of different resources that can help identifying insects and plant diseases. So a quick internet search with just a description of the insect and the damage to the plant can be a really good start. But for more personalized information, you can always contact your local extension office, who can give you much more location-specific and expert advice. I also want to note that you should be cautious about IDs and advice you receive from pest control or land care companies, because they obviously do have an incentive to sell products or services associated with that advice. There's also some really great online options that might help you figure out what insects are in your yard. Bugguide.net is a great online resource for insect ID with a community of experts that all help provide photo ID, and I've actually used that a lot myself. And also posting a photo on social media platforms can also really result in helpful information. So then the question is when and how to intervene. So sometimes intervening with non-chemical methods is needed when something seems out of balance, or the damage is a threat to the survival of the plant. In this case, again, flowers are being eaten by butterflies and eliminating those pollen and nectar resources that attract bees and other beneficial insects. And I want to note that as home gardeners, we can tolerate more damage to plants and gardens than, say, farmers can. And often pests may be present at a level that can simply be kept in check by beneficial insects and don't threaten the health of your plant. So with the intervention in this example, the presence of the caterpillars itself wasn't a threshold for Emily to take action. In fact, it's great that caterpillars, were using her garden plants as a resource because they're food for birds. They develop into pollinators. They're part of this whole, ecosystem in your garden. But in some years, the caterpillar infestations, weren't being kept in check by predators. The outbreak is kind of an imbalance in the system. So in this case, Emily's long-term response was to keep increasing the diversity in her yard to promote beneficial insects that can feed on those caterpillars. But in the short term, there's a variety of different non-chemical methods to deal with pests. What Emily used in this case, for many diseases and larval infestations, sanitation, which is just the removal of infested plant material, is a great choice for reducing the level of damage and again breaking that development cycle of the pest. Infested flowers or other plant material can be cut and thrown away. You don't want to compost it because you want to move the source of that infestation off-site. For other insect outbreaks, just hand picking or squishing pests or knocking them off with water can be a really simple but effective first step. Hand picking can be tedious. I've done this a lot with larger caterpillars in the garden, but it is deliberate and it's cautious and it saves other wildlife from harm. For weeds, you can consider using barriers and mulches to suppress them and hand pulling them before they go to seed to reduce seed set. There's all sorts of new ergonomic weeding tools that make weeding much easier and quicker than simply just pulling it by hand. Um, Ultimately, pest control is often simply about figuring out what attracted the pest to your yard and what can be changed so that that pest can't thrive. And I think it is really neat how a quick online search these days often does give a good overview of any pest and ways to manage it without chemicals. I want to quickly wrap up this section here just by touching on a few hidden risk areas for pesticide exposure at home. I'm bringing this up just so you're aware of where some pesticide risks may come from when you're creating habitat for invertebrates in your home yard. So one of these is treatments from pest control companies designed to kill nuisance pests like spiders and ants, or treatments to deal with structural pests. A quick practical real-world example of this was, again, from that milkweed study I mentioned, where we sampled milkweed plants up and down the Central Valley of California to see what types of pesticides were present. At one home where pesticides hadn't been applied in at least 6 years, the milkweed was contaminated with concerning levels of an insecticide that's commonly used to manage structural pests, fipronil. And we found out that right before the current owner moved in 6 years prior, the home had been treated for ants or termites. And then shortly after moving in, the new homeowner planted the milkweed in that treated area, and that soil has been a source of insecticide exposure ever since. So pollinator attractive plants around the exterior of houses may be a source of exposure if those homes are treated for structural pests. Another hidden risk area are trees. So arborists may treat sick-looking trees with a fungicide or insecticide, and some commonly used systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids can last for a really long time in woody plants for years, particularly injections into the trunk. That means the leaves, the flowers, all of the plant tissue will contain these insecticides and be a source of exposure to the insects that feed on its leaves or pollen. And we're not saying to never treat a tree, but just to consider whether the pest is threatening the health of the tree or if it's just kind of a cosmetic thing, and whether it will keep coming back and require treatment year after year. If those are the case, you might think about what your options are and kind of weigh the pros and cons. A very depressing and kind of infamous example here in Oregon was when blooming linden trees were sprayed with a neonicotinoid in a Target parking lot in Wilsonville. They treated these trees because there were aphids creating honeydew, just that sticky substance that aphids kind of emit, and it was dropping on customer cars and making them sticky. And an estimated 50 to 100,000 bumblebees were killed. And even though that's really sad, I just wanted to highlight this to show the impact that one pesticide application can have. So lastly, another hidden risk for pesticide exposure in the home garden is plants purchased from nurseries. So the demand for nursery plants to be aesthetically appealing, pest-free and damage-free is really high. And that combined with interstate rules to reduce pest spread really leads to significant pesticide use in nursery production. And a number of studies have found neonicotinoids and other pesticides contaminating plants, including a different study that we at the Xerces Society performed, where we sampled milkweed at retail nurseries in 15 different states across the country. And milkweed samples from these nurseries had an average of 12 pesticides present on them, including on plants that were labeled bee-friendly and we don't spray neonics. So this is obviously concerning, but what can you do? So there's 3 steps to take when buying. You can ask for organic plants, try to avoid plants treated with these long-lived, highly toxic insecticides, and try to get to know your nursery practices to see if they're using pollinator-friendly production. And even if your local nursery doesn't know the answer, simply asking the question will help demonstrate consumer demand for bee-safe plants and hopefully can start to move that needle a little bit. And if you don't know whether the plant you bought was grown in a pollinator-friendly manner, you can assume it might be contaminated. But there are some actions that you can take to limit harm, including assuming the soil your plant came in is contaminated with maybe a drench, for example. So you can dump as much of that soil as you can so that the plant doesn't continue taking out more pesticides from it once you plant it in your yard. You can also net plants to prevent pollinators from visiting that first year. While plants can have high concentrations of pesticides in their leaves and pollen and nectar, that does break down over time. And after a little bit, the plants will be much less toxic. So by the next year, removing that net and allowing pollinators to visit is one solution. So ultimately, a common thread that you've likely picked up through this presentation is that, I really encourage everybody to think of your yard as habitat that's being used by this broad community of insects, birds, and other animals. And the choices that we make in our green spaces, in our residential landscapes, really can have wide-reaching impacts on biodiversity. And yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to kind of think about that broad community of other life when you're making the management decisions in your yards. Um, I kind of want to end here by re-emphasizing that you can make a difference at home. Habitat loss and fragmentation is the leading cause of species extinctions. But I think the great news for all of us is that insects are really able to use small patches and partial habitats like yards and parks, and improvements that we make to these habitats at home really can have dramatic results. And beyond, planting habitat plants and providing shelter, protecting these spaces from pesticides is one of the most important things you can do to conserve invertebrates. And yeah, I just think that by doing this, we really can just create these havens for pollinators and all sorts of other beneficial insects in our yards. And the more people doing this in your yard, your neighbor's yard, we can scale up from the lot level, the 1 yard level, and start creating these connected larger scale habitats across our residential spaces, which I think is a really exciting idea.
Aaron,
So I
thank you
think
so
now,
much.
yeah, we have time hopefully for a little
Yes,
bit of
yes, we
questions,
do. And
and
we have some
yeah.
questions. And I just want to say, my first question is, how do we get enough caterpillars for those chickadees? I'm
Oh my
worried.
gosh. I know whenever when I remember that fact, it really just kind of blows my mind. It's yeah.
Yes. And yet there are chickadees all over. So apparently there are a lot of caterpillars that we must never even see.
There are, yeah. I think that, it's really amazing how many insects are out there when you really pay attention, but it also really highlights, why it's so important to conserve these insects,
Yeah.
not just for their own intrinsic sake, but also because they really are a foundational part of that food chain for so many different species. And yeah, the pollination services they provide are obviously huge, but the fact that so many things eat them is just, yeah, it's really astounding.
Well, let me go through the questions that have come in. Jackie says, at the end of the summer to control raging yellow jackets, our garden advisor used yellow jacket traps. How do you feel about that?
That's a really great question. So from my understanding, yellow jacket traps can actually be most effective. Yeah, I feel like the end of the summer. I think that so let me kind of take a step back there. So kind of like bumblebees, actually, yellow jackets, only the queen overwinters. So, unlike a honeybee where you have this long-lived hive where, workers and the queen will, live for a while. A bumblebee or a yellow jacket will emerge in the spring, start a colony, have babies that are workers. The workers will go out and forage. They'll build up a colony, but then by the end of the summer, the workers die off. The original queen dies off, and only the new queens will overwinter. So I think using a trap can be effective. One issue with that is that depending on when you're using it, you might be attracting more yellow jackets in, which can be a nuisance. One thing that we hear people recommend is that if it's the end of the summer, you're into fall and winter, you don't have a risk of being stung, going around your property and finding old rodent holes and things like that, and trying to kind of knock those holes in is an effective way to reduce places where yellow jackets can nest, because lots of them tend to nest in old rodent holes. But then, yeah, using the traps at the end of the season or the very beginning of the season when yellow jacket queens are beginning to kind of fly. I think that's a good strategy to try. I wouldn't use them in the middle of the summer though, when it's mostly workers, because from the reading I've read through different IPM suggestions, if you're using them in the middle of the summer, you might just end up drawing in more yellow jackets from the surrounding area. And if you're just trapping workers, that's not going to have a huge impact on the larger population.
Okay. Now here is someone, Kimberly believes that she saw lightning bugs at the Portland Zoo a few years ago. Are
Oh,
you aware of us having any lightning bugs here?
yeah, there's so lightning bugs, fireflies. There's there this a decently diverse group of insects, and not all of them actually flash in the way that we typically think of fireflies flashing. So you can find insects that look pretty much identical to, a firefly that you might find, west or east of the Rockies. They just don't flash the same way that some of those other species do. I'm not aware of flashing species that are really west of the Rockies or in Oregon. So I'd be curious to learn more, and I could check with some of our firefly experts on Xerces staff, but you will find, really closely related species.
So are they considered to be pests or beneficial
They're
insects?
they're not considered to be pests. No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, they're beneficial. They cruise around in the soil. So some fireflies can actually take up to 3 years developing in the soil as larvae and then pupa,
Wow.
and they're predators. So like all of those other insects that I was listing, they just chow down on other insects in the soil as they develop before pupating and becoming the adult form, flying around and
Okay.
flashing.
All right. And Linda says that she has left tall echinacea stalks in place for birds and bees. When is it safe to prune them out?
Yeah, that's a great question, Linda. So this is what it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around and explain. So when you're leaving stalks out for insects to nest in, what you want to do is, so if say this summer you have plants that grew, the foliage came out, they're tall, they have stems, and they died. Um, you want to leave those stems this winter and then all the way through next summer, because next year that's when the bees are going to be able to use that as a resource. They're not going to go into, a live stem and nest. They're going to nest in a dead one. So then you'll want to leave it out that entire next summer, and then spring and fall. And then so coming back around, then you could prune them out in I would say like late May to be safe, because there are still some bees that are emerging in May. But that's, a whole calendar year after, if that makes sense. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
very attractive for the garden, though.
Yeah, so one of the things, if there's a place where it's a really high value kind of aesthetic area where you really don't want to have any kind of dead stems, is you can cut those and then kind of pile them in a different part of your yard where they're a little bit less visible, and that's acceptable as well.
Okay, so they can be horizontal. They don't have to be standing up.
Yeah, I think keeping them in place is best, just because it's less disturbance and things like
Yeah,
that. But it's also, it's much better than not having any, is to kind of, because I think yeah, I think that piling them, there can be more risks just of, you're handling them, things could get squished, things could
yeah,
get,
yeah.
whatever. But it's also a perfectly good strategy just to kind of pile some of them in a different part of the yard.
Okay. And do you have any advice for people who live in apartments? I assume this would be with a balcony or a terrace of some sort.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I struggled with a bit also, just kind of being a renter myself. So I think living in an apartment with a balcony, yeah, planting plants in pots is still a great strategy. If you can find some great pollinator plants, there's plenty of our, both annuals and perennials that will do perfectly well in a pot. You might just have to water them more than you would if they were in the ground, just because they're going to be a little bit more exposed and not be able to kind of get down deep. That was one of the things I noticed when I did kind of grow some of these pollinator plants in pots, is that yeah, I had to water them more frequently. But doing that is, I think, a great thing, because every little bit helps. If just having a few plants, you can support dozens of different beneficial insects and bees. So I would encourage that. One other tip I would have too is that if you live in something like an apartment complex, or a situation like when I lived in Corvallis doing grad school, we rented like a kind of a triplex in a house. I was just talking to the property management company and just saying, hey, do you mind if I install some plants, or ask if the landscaper would be willing to kind of maybe change the way that they're managing the property. So instead of just having a mulched area next to the lawn and a tree, for example, suggesting, hey, you could plant a couple of these plants. And I think that if you kind of make the argument that many of these plants are pretty low maintenance, they don't require a whole lot of effort, I think approaching it that way is a way that you can make a huge difference. And the worst thing they can do is say no. So
I would say it can't hurt to ask.
it can't hurt to
make a
ask. Exactly.
suggestion.
Yeah.
All right. Olivia would like to know if there's any good information yet about the possible impact on native insects of the injections, the insecticide injections going into the Oregon ash
That's a
tree.
really great question. So unfortunately, the insecticides that are used to combat emerald ash borer are toxic to all sorts of other insects. They're not specific to just the EAB. So treating the tree so that it kills emerald ash borer larvae will unfortunately also make it toxic to all of the different insects, especially Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths. A whole variety of them feed on emerald ash borer, or sorry, not emerald ash borer, on ash trees. So it's definitely one of those kind of struggles. If you have an ash tree in your yard, it's one of those situations, there's not a great answer for it, where it's weighing the pros and cons of treating the tree and saving it versus removing it and implanting a different species. And yeah, unfortunately, there's not a great answer to that. But
No.
yeah, the emamectin benzoate is a popular one because it is the most effective, I think, and it will still unfortunately be toxic to a lot of other insects.
Okay. And the final question is one that I feel competent to answer, and then you can chime in, Aaron.
Please do.
Janet wants to know, do you have any advice for how to approach the pest management company when they come to my door? I get 2 or 3 coming every year, and they want to stop the bees, wasps, spiders that are nesting in my house. And I say, thank you very much. I'm not interested. I like all of those insects. And then I close the door. So Aaron, anything you got to add to that?
I know, I really like that, Hope. Yeah, that's actually something we've been talking about a bit internally, and I think it would be nice to kind of come up with a resource. I think that unfortunately so often, and I've seen this firsthand, they're hiring college kids, people who might believe kind of the pest control propaganda that's being fed them. They'll say, oh, because one of the time when I was a renter in Corvallis, one of the pest control companies, one of the trucks pulled up and this young guy got out and was going around the house spraying and sprinkling stuff. And again, we were renters, we didn't even know what was happening. And I ran out and I was like, what are you doing? And he used the line that I hear people say all the time. He said, oh, don't worry, it's natural, it's derived from flowers. And he was talking about pyrethrum, or he might have actually been using pyrethroids, which are highly toxic to all sorts of insects. And he was sprinkling stuff right where I knew ground nesting bees were nesting, and it was a really frustrating experience. But I think what you were saying, Hope, just say, I'm not interested, but then also, maybe the person doesn't even know. So saying something like, do you know that's actually going to kill all of these other insects?
Yeah.
Maybe will open their eyes. But yeah, it's definitely a hard thing, especially when they really are so persistent in their messaging that, this is safe. It'll only kill the target pest. It's
Yeah.
definitely a challenge to kind of counter that.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And
Thank
I think that we've all learned a lot, or if we haven't learned, it has reinforced what we as master gardeners have known. And it's really been great having you spend the time with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And on this last slide here, I have my personal Xerces email as well as just the general pesticides@xerces.org email. So if you have any other questions that come to mind or you're interested in some resources, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Okay.